Welcome back. In our last session, we introduced you to the Gospel of John. In particular, we compared John to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are covered in other parts of this website. Then we examined what the author presents as his purpose for writing the Gospel. After this, we looked at what some have thought concerning the author of the Gospel, both from external evidence of the Fathers and what the Gospel itself has to say. This led to a discussion concerning the date when the Gospel was written. Then I presented a brief outline of the structure of the Gospel in order to be able to place particular units in the context of the whole. We followed with two specifics of Johannine theology: the notion of dualism coupled with the us-them mentality found in the Gospel, and the notion of church found in John's Gospel, what's known as ecclesiology. Session 1 concluded with a brief discussion of the history of the Johannine community. With that background, we can now jump into the Gospel text. The Gospel of John begins with an 18-verse prologue, John 1, 1-18. This prologue introduces the Word. First, we shall give some introductory points concerning the prologue. Generally, the prologue is divided into four major parts. The first speaks of the Word before creation, the pre-existent Word. Then it moves to the role of the Word in creation. This progresses into a discussion of the Word before the Incarnation, and then logically to the fourth part, the incarnate Word. Interesting it is that the use of the word word or logos, as the Greek has it, that we find in the prologue, is never again found in the gospel text. Rather, in the final verse, 1:18, the word or logos is equated with the Son, which is the term we find in the rest of the gospel. More on that at the end of the prologue. Of the four Gospels, John has the most imposing beginning.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men.
The structure of the prologue is generally seen by scholars to be four poetic stanzas into which three prose segments have been inserted. The four poetic stanzas are the four divisions that we presented for this talk. The three prose insertions appear at various points in the prologue. The first, concerning John the Baptist, appears between the second and third stanzas, John chapter 1, verses 6-8. The second appears at the end of the third stanza and is a further definition of what the term children of God means, John 1:13. The third appears after the fourth stanza and contains the initial testimony of John the Baptist to Jesus and a saying on the relationship of the law to Jesus, along with the identification of the Word and the Son. Proper understanding of the prologue depends significantly upon the nuances of the tenses of the verbs that the author uses in Greek. Therefore, begging your indulgence, I shall spend a few moments on the grammar of the Greek verb, which does have several significant differences from the grammar of the English verb. In both English and Greek, we have verbs that denote present and past action. But in Greek, there are further nuances. Action can be progressive, implying the ongoing nature of an action, sort of like being in a passenger car moving down a road and seeing various scenes passing by. They can be punctiliar, a rather fancy word to describe a particular point in time. Continuing the car analogy, you can take out your camera and snap a picture which freezes one moment of the drive in the picture, or they can be completed. Later on your computer, you look at the picture you took on the journey. That picture is a present effect, the picture you're looking at, of a past action, a scene on your journey. With that little intro, let's look at some Greek tenses which express these various states. In denoting present actions, there are two significant tenses in Greek. The present, which expresses progressive action in the present tense, the car moving down the road, and the perfect, which expresses completed action, the picture of the journey. Another example of a perfect or completed action is a pie which a baker bakes. It's the result in the present of the action of mixing the ingredients, rolling out the crust, putting together the filling, assembling and baking the pie. The result is in the present, but the work was in the past and is now completed. In denoting past actions, there are three significant tenses in Greek. The imperfect, which expresses progressive action in the past. You were traveling down a road. The imperfect emphasizes that continuing notion of traveling. When you took out your camera and snapped a picture, you stopped time, as it were. That point of stop time is designated by the aorist tense. The difference between I was writing, a process, and I wrote, a moment in time. Finally, completed action in the past is designated by the pluperfect tense. When the cake is eaten and nothing remains, you might say the baker had baked the cake, but it was so good there is now nothing left. Or the student who makes the excuse to the teacher, I did my homework, but the dog ate it. The action of doing the homework resulted in a completed paper, which no longer exists because of the appetite of the dog. Well, enough grammar. Let's put it into practice in the prologue. The first stanza of the prologue on the word before creation begins,
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men.
The was in this phrase is significant. It's an imperfect of the verb to be, ein in Greek. It expresses the fact that long before anything existed, the Word existed continuously without beginning. And the Word was with God. That continually existing Word was present with God. Also implied is that it was distinct from God. The next phrase, and the Word was God, can be translated another way, what God was, the Word was. This is a poetic way of saying what we say in the Sunday Creed, consubstantial with the Father. The Word and God, the Father, are of the same substance, consubstantial yet distinct. This one Word was in the beginning with God, or in God's presence. By the continual repetition of the verb was, the imperfect of to be, we have here a very succinct poetic summary of what will become over the centuries the doctrine of the Trinity. Nothing has been created yet, and so we say that the Word was pre-existent. It existed before creation, which we shall examine in the next stanza of the prologue. Our tense and our verb both change here. Instead of talking about continuous being, using the verb to be, now we talk about punctiliar becoming. The imperfect tense of to be becomes the aorist of the verb become. That is, going from non-existence to existence. All things were made, became, through him, the Word. The use of the aorist over the imperfect implies the creation took place in a particular moment of time. And without him became not even one thing that has become. The fact of creation is repeated. We see again the Word as the agent of creation. And that agrees with what is recorded in Genesis 1:3. Genesis says, and God said. What did God say? God said a word or words, let there be light. And throughout the Genesis creation narrative, we see that repeated. And God said. What's different here is that the word almost seems to be a person. Indeed, we see later that it is a person, the second person of the Trinity as the doctrine is developed, the Son. Continuing, there is a clause that modifies one thing, namely, that has become, which uses the perfect tense of the verb become. It refers to the completed act of creation. Then the topic changes from creation to its continuance. Two key Johannine concepts are introduced: light and life. In him was life. The Logos Word was living. Then the writer employs what's known as a stepwise structure, using the last word of one phrase as the first of the next. See how he does it with life. Continuing. And the life was the light of human beings. Hence, the life of the Word enlightened human beings. The life of the Logos Word brought light to humanity. And correlatively, the light that was first created by God's Word in Genesis makes it possible for life to exist. Now the step continues. The light enlightened the darkness of human lives, shining in the darkness. This will be a key theme of John. Jesus, the light, will encounter various human beings in the course of the gospel. For example, Nicodemus in chapter 3, the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, the crowd at the Bread of Life discourse in chapter 6, the blind man in chapter 9, the sisters Mary and Martha in chapter 11, and even Pilate in the Passion narrative in chapters 18 and 19. In those encounters, Jesus will shine his divine light on the sinful darkness of their lives and lead them to decide in favor of or against the light. The final phrase, and the darkness has not overcome it, can have a double meaning. The Greek verb katalambano can mean overcome. In that case, the meaning would be that despite all the efforts of the powers of darkness to snuff out the light, overcome the light, they will be unable to do so. Even the moment of seeming victory at the crucifixion will be short-lived, as Jesus will conquer death in the resurrection. But the verb katalambano can also mean understand or comprehend. And we will see in the course of the gospel that many of those whom Jesus will encounter will not comprehend what he's saying or even who he is. After these two poetic stanzas, we encounter the first prose insertion. It introduces John the Baptist. Using the aorist of the verb ginomai, we're told, there was a man. Literally, there became a man. This implies that John came into existence in a particular moment of time. Further, John is described as sent from God. In other words, he is an agent of God, come with a particular mission. Then we're given the man's name, John. Then John's mission is specified. This one came for witness. That is, he is to witness concerning the light, leading all who hear his witness to belief. The Greek word for witness is marturia, from which we get the English word martyr. A martyr witnesses to his or her love of Christ through the shedding of blood, the giving of their life. Then comes an emphatic statement. That one was not the light. John is distinct from Jesus. He's not the light. Jesus is. Then his mission is stressed one more time. He was, or he became, in order to witness concerning the light. John is a witness, one who will speak on behalf of and point out the light. This clear differentiation between Jesus and John is due to the fact that in the time of the gospel, certain groups felt that John the Baptist was the light, was the Messiah. All four Gospels take pains to show that this is not the case. Here is one of the ways the fourth Gospel accomplishes that. The prose insertion on John ended. The text moves back to the third stanza of the poetic prologue. Further emphasizing the distinction between John and Jesus, the adjective true now modifies light. That adjective signifies the sense of authentic, real, genuine, or actual. So if anyone thought John, the witness, was the light, they're mistaken. The true light, which enlightens every human being, was coming into the world. As we translate it, the participial phrase, coming into the world, modifies light. However, it's just as plausible to translate it modifying human being. Thus, who enlightens every human being who comes into the world. However, given the emphases on the prologue thus far, the first translation seems much more probable. The stanza continues, saying that he, the Word, was in the world. This introduces the noun world, or cosmos in Greek. It's another favorite of John. It has, according to Maloney, three possible meanings. First, it can refer to created reality. Second, it can be the arena where the saving revelation of God in and through Jesus Christ takes place. And third, it's a place where the power of darkness reigns as the prince of this world. Here, the first seems to be fitting. All creation, the world inhabited by humanity. That notion is reinforced by the next phrase, and the world was made through him. That basically repeats the first stanza of the poem. It's a reference back to verse 1:3, all things were made through him. Included in that all things of 1:3 is the world of 1:10. Then, an allusion to the fifth verse of the prologue, the world did not know him. Beasley Murray sees a parallel here to the hymn of wisdom found in the first book of Enoch. It says, wisdom went forth to make her dwelling among the children of men, and found no dwelling place there. 1 Enoch 42:2. The prologue continues. He came unto his own, ta idia. There are several ways to interpret this. Particularly, the question emerges, what does his own, or ta idia, mean? Some would say that this is merely a repetition of the preceding verse, and his own would be all humankind in the world. Others would specify it as relating specifically to the chosen people, Israel. In that case, it could be a reference to the prophetic word, which was mediated to Israel through the messengers of God and the prophets of the Old Testament. That would be my particular understanding of this text. The result of his coming to his own is then specified. His own did not receive him. The prophetic word was rejected by Israel. They stoned and treated ill the prophets whom God sent. It's also a prefigurement then of what will happen in the gospel text. The message of Jesus will be received negatively by official Judaism. But the response to the word was not all negative. There was a positive response, signified by the particle de. But as many as received him, the prologue continues, he gave them the power to become children of God. Note, tekna is a favorite Johannine word. It's the typical form of address to the community in the first letter of John, my children. Neither author uses the term son, huios, with reference to believers. That word is reserved specifically for Jesus in Johannine literature. Then the receivers are defined, those believing in his name. In other words, those who hear the word and change their lives, making a commitment to the word, are children of God. Beasley Murray defines believe in as the acceptance of Jesus to the full extent of his revelation. It's a concept that he derives from Rudolf Schnackenberg. We now come to the second prose insertion. This one specifies more precisely what it is to be a child of God, that is, those believing from verse 12. This specification comes in 3 negatives leading up to 1 positive. This is done for emphasis. Children of God, that is, believers, are not born from blood. In other words, belief or faith is not something which we inherit, such as our eye color, etc. Nor are they born from the will of the flesh, that is, some sort of sexual desire. Nor are they born from the will of a male, that is, human initiative. It's significant to note that there are 2 Greek words for man. The first, which has been used up to this point in the prologue, is anthropos, which is man as opposed to animal, zoe. Hence can be translated as human being and is inclusive. The other, aner, used here is man as opposed to woman, and generally is translated as male and is exclusive. This, according to Arnold, refers to the cultural notion of the husband's headship or the initiative of the male, which in that society could then bespeak all human initiative, since women were subordinate to men in that culture. Putting all 3 together, we see that the author is emphasizing that being a child of God is not achieved through human means. Rather, it is from God. It is something which is the gracious gift of God. We do not come to believe on our own. It's a response to the promptings of God in our lives. One last point on verse 13. There is a variant reading of the translation of this verse which makes the plural, with reference to believers, a singular. More particular, a singular masculine, making it thus a reference to the Word. The Word, who was not born from flesh, from the will of men, etc. Some scholars, citing patristic tradition, will see this as being scriptural background to the notion of virginal conception. However, The weight of the manuscript tradition falls on the plural rather than the singular. We come now to the key stanza of the prologue. All of the above material could have reference to the Old Testament concept of wisdom, or the contemporary philosophical concept of gnosis or knowledge, or several other popular concepts of the first century. However, when we come to verse 14, there is one and only one possibility. One could say that this verse baptizes the prologue. The Word, which was with God, now becomes flesh. So the eternal Word, designated by the imperfects of the verb to be at the beginning of the prologue, now, in a particular moment of time, designated by the aorist of become, takes on flesh, becomes one of us. The Latin word for flesh is carnis, and so this event has become known as the Incarnation, the becoming flesh. It's also behind the word introduced into the creed, incarnate. The next phrase typically has been translated and dwelt among us. But that does not at all do justice to the Greek, which is literally translated and pitched his tent among us. The verb skenao, which comes from the root skene, which means tent, is pitch a tent. That translation evokes the whole notion of the Exodus, where the presence of God in the Ark of the Covenant traveled with the Israelites in a tent. That tent eventually became the temple, and God's presence dwelt in the temple. Thus, when the Word became flesh, that is, a human being, God was now dwelling with his people, as he did in times past. The next phrase confirms what I just observed. We have beheld his glory. The glory of God, or the kavod Adonai, was the presence of God in the temple, in the tent, during the wanderings following the Exodus, and ultimately in the temple when the temple was built. That glory is then specified as glory as of an only begotten, monogenes, from the Father. Now, to understand what's being said here, it's necessary to look at the meaning of that adjective monogenes. Literally, monogenes has the sense of the adjective one of a kind or unique in its genus. Beasley Murray points out that it's not the sense of an only son of the Father. It's not his onlyness, but rather his uniqueness that's stressed. It translates the Hebrew yachid, a word that's used of an only or beloved child. For example, Isaac, Abraham's son, or Jephthah's only daughter. An alternative reading of yachid is beloved, that is, agapetos in Greek. That's the word used of Isaac in Genesis 22:2, 12, and 16, along with Hebrews 11:17. Thus, the use of the word agapetos in the synoptic accounts of the baptism of Jesus may have the Hebrew yachid underlying it. You are my beloved son. Verse 14 ends with the adjectival phrase, full of grace and truth. This is a translation of the very common chesed va'emet found in the Old Testament as a term of God's faithfulness or covenantal graciousness. The adjectival phrase modifies only begotten or beloved son, thus signifying that the gracious constancy of God in the Old Testament is now manifest in its fullness in the Logos Son. Maloney sees this not as a conjunction of two concepts, but rather what is known as an ep-exegetical chi, or an ep-exegetical and. Now that's a fancy term that simply means the second term further defines the significance of the first. It's somewhat akin to our usage of the Latin abbreviation id est, or that is. Grace is God's gracious constancy, which we as human beings are totally undeserving of. The Hebrew notion of chesed. Truth is firmness, stability, or steadfastness that translates into reality or authenticity. Here, the Hebrew root or concept is emeth. Thus, this has the sense of the Son is full of grace, that is, truth, which really, honestly, actually is. We now come to the third prose insertion, which interrupts the flow of the final fourth stanza of the prologue. Again, we meet John the Baptist. This time we get the content of his witness to the Word. This one was he of whom I said, "He who comes after me ranks before me, for he was before me." Again, we see the polemic against those who claim that John the Baptist was the Messiah. This time it appears in a form very close to that used in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The author is careful to draw a clear distinction between John and the Word, Jesus. The Word is clearly superior to John in status. He ranks before me, and he has a priority in time. He was before me. We return to the second part of the poetry of the fourth stanza in the prologue. This verse gives a reason for the assertion of verse 14 that the Word was full of grace, that is, truth. That reason is that all have shared in the fullness of the Word. Grace instead of grace. This means simply that the graces of the old order, the Old Testament, have now in Christ been replaced by graces of the new order, or the New Testament. This is the introduction of a key Johannine theme which will run through the gospel. In Jesus, the institutions and feasts of Judaism are brought to completion and perfected. As we go through the gospel, we shall see this developing at Cana in Galilee in chapter 2. The two graces are then specified in the last part of this prose insertion. The law was given through Moses. This was the first grace, the old order, the law. The passive voice of the verb give implies that the law was a gift given by God. Then, grace and truth, or grace that is truth, came through Jesus Christ. This was the second grace, the new order, mediated through Jesus. We have here the key identification of Jesus Christ with the Word. Thus, the gift of the law is perfected, brought to completion in the gift of the Incarnation, the Word becoming flesh. The prologue concludes with a generally accepted dictum of the Old Testament. No one has ever seen God. Not even Moses, the great prophet of the Old Testament. He saw the back of God in Exodus 34:18-20. But now, the Word incarnate, the beloved, unique Son, who was closely related to the Father, being in or at the bosom of the Father, begins the task of making him known. Three things become significant from this last verse for our interpretation of the gospel. First, the Logos, Word made flesh, is identified with the Son, the monogenes Son, the unique, beloved, only Son. Second, the title, word, or logos, which has been predominant in the prologue, will not appear again in the gospel. Rather, Jesus will be known as the Son, and his relationship to God, spoken of in the prologue, will become his relationship with the Father. This leads to the third point. Jesus, the Son, has become one of us, with the purpose of revealing or making known the Father to us. The rest of the gospel will be a narrative of that revelation, that authentic revelation from the only Son who shares the story of the nature of God. Well, that's about all of the prologue there is in the Gospel of John. It's a wonderful melt of prose and poetry which introduces the major themes of the Gospel and sets the stage for the revelation of the Father through the Son, Jesus. Next time, we'll look at the ministry of John the Baptist and his witness to Jesus. See you then.